I'm Simeon Bankoff, Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council. On behalf of HDC, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this, the opening keynote address and opening event for our 18th annual Preservation Conference. A few little bits. I'd also like to, this conference is only brought to you through the hard work of my hardworking staff. I'd like to thank all of them for all their great work. Frampton Tolbert, Nadezhda Williams, Michelle Arbalou, and Sarah Romanowski. As always, I just stand here and talk. They do all the work. Also, it is brought to you by, this conference is also co-sponsored by HGC's neighborhood partners, of which I see a number in the audience. Thank you very much. And the New York chapter of the American Society for Landscape Architects. More about them in a moment. We're supported in part by public funds from the City of New York Department of Cultural Affairs, in partnership with the City Council and the New York State Council on the Arts, with support of Governor Andrew Cuomo and the New York State Legislature. Additional support is provided by council members Inez Dickens, Daniel Gorodnick, Stephen Levin, and Rosie Mendez. We're going to be hearing from Rosie tomorrow. She should be showing up, so we thank all of them for that. There will be, after the presentation, Mr. Birnbaum will be taking questions, and then we hope you all join us for some drinks outside. And it's my pleasure now to introduce two people. First, Denisha Williams. Ms. Williams is the president of the New York chapter of the American Society for Landscape Architects. ASLA's New York chapter represents over 500 landscape architects in New York City, Westchester, and Long Island. The chapter's mission is to lead, educate, and participate in the careful stewardship, wise planning, and artful design of our cultural and natural environments. The ASLA promotes the field of landscape architecture and advocates for policy positions that advance sustainable, environmentally friendly practices. In addition to her service as the president of the chapter and practice as a landscape architect, Denisha has a background in historic preservation before returning to school. For her landscape architecture degree in 2000, she managed preservation-based downtown revitalization programs in Texas through the National Trust's Main Street program. During this period, she also served as a municipal historic preservation officer. She maintains strong interest in the preservation of structures and landscapes and resides in a proposed historic district in the Upper West Side. I think that probably many people in the audience are familiar with that one. After Ms. Williams speaks, then we will have further remarks by Françoise Bullock. Françoise is, in addition to her many other achievements, the president of the Historic Districts Council. So, Ms. Williams, then Ms. Bullock.
Thank you so much, Simeon. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the New York chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects, I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to all of you who are here tonight. Our organization is really thrilled to have the opportunity to partner with the Historic Districts Council on this event. And we would particularly, again, like to thank Simeon and all of the staff at the HDC, but I'd like to give a special thanks to Sarah Romanowski for reaching out to us to collaborate on this event. The topic of this year's conference, The Great Outside, is truly aptly chosen. What would our historic districts really be without our open spaces? We would still have these very cherished collections of historic buildings, but at the same time, we know that somehow it's the great open spaces that often define the districts themselves and give them their whole reason for being. Parks, plazas, boulevards, tree-lined streetscapes, private gardens, all of these outdoor spaces are far more than just amenities to our districts. They are the places we love, and they're also the location that real estate professionals love to talk about. As urban landscape architects, we are particularly proud of the contributions that our predecessors have made in designing the city. And we are pleased to be a part of the continuing evolution of the urban environment. We hope you enjoy the excellent lineup of speakers tonight and throughout the weekend and the tours. Tonight, we're particularly happy to salute a landscape architect, one of our own, who as the keynote speaker tonight. who no doubt, as he always does, will deepen our understanding of the emerging emphasis of cultural landscapes nationwide. Charles Birnbaum has done more than anyone to bring to light the importance of designed landscapes and to deepen our awareness of historic landscape architecture across the country. And Charles is absolutely the most passionate advocate of cultural landscapes and landscape architecture of anyone we know. In fact, I have to share the story that we honored Charles this year at our President's Dinner as with the Service Award, and he proceeded to demonstrate his zeal by leaping tall furnishings with a single bound to make a particularly passionate point. So I don't know if Charles will stay on the ground tonight or not, but I'm sure he'll fill our minds with great leaps of concept. So I will leave the more formal introductions to Francoise, but again, we welcome you and we thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome everybody tonight to our 2012 Preservation Conference. But first of all, I want to say a few words about HDC. All of you know HDC and know what we do, but it's good to remind ourselves that we are the advocate for the preservation of historic neighborhoods in New York City and historic buildings in New York City. And this means being in the trenches for very small problems like a row house that is in danger of being defaced, or a historic district that consistently gets ignored and doesn't get designated. So we go from the very small to the very large, and we go from things that we can plan over a long period of time to crises that just happen on our lap in a minute, in an instant, and we have to respond because the building is in danger. So that's what we do, and we do this at the level of buildings, we do this at the level of policy, so our involvement is very broad. Our most recent initiative, which you may have gathered from the panels which are outside, is called Six to Celebrate. And this is a program that's in its second year and is going absolutely fantastically well. And each year we're selecting 6 neighborhood groups, and for a year we help them achieve their preservation goals. And it's really interesting what the list is, because it's so easy for people to say, oh, preservation is about elitism. Preservation is about people trying to protect masterful buildings done by great white men. And our list this year is, I'm going to read it because I don't want to forget anybody. Our list this year, as you've seen outside, is the Port Morris gantries, which are a wonderful set of fairy gantries on the Bronx waterfront. Also in the Bronx, we have Van Cortlandt Village in Kingsbridge Heights, which is a series of little freestanding Tudor revival houses, quite picturesque. But it's also a neighborhood that includes the Shalom Aleichem co-op, which is a socially and historically incredibly important and also architecturally beautiful building. We have in Queens, we have the architecturally diverse Bay Ridge neighborhood and stately Victorian Flatbush. And the far, that's in Brooklyn. And sorry, I'm born in Paris. So in Queens, in Queens we have the Far Rockaway beachside bungalows in Manhattan, the Morningside Heights neighborhood. So you see it's very diverse. It's from bungalows to brownstone to Bunshaft, because recently, as we know, the Manihani, the interior of the bank at 500 Fifth Avenue, was designated. So we don't stop at a single period. We're not stuck in a period. We're not stuck in a certain social stratum. So this is what we do. So why should HDC be interested in open spaces? We deal with buildings in general. Well, we're interested in open space for the reasons that Denisha has told us. We're also interested in open spaces because we feel they're under a tremendous amount of stress and tremendous amount of threat. I don't know if any one of you has been to Bryant Park recently. Bryant Park, for 4 months in the year, is taken over by a huge 3-story pavilion that is actually a commercial restaurant. So this public park is now occupied by 3 commercial restaurants This pavilion is 2 or 3 stories high. It's clad in vinyl on a tube structure, and it's installed the first week of November. It's just coming down right now. So we have a public park which is now covered in blue AstroTurf. My office is nearby, so it's like I live in a constant state of rage about this. So the problem is that the people in preservation movement run the risk of abandoning the discussion of open spaces to the green movement. Forgetting that spaces like the space behind the library, Bryant Park, is part of the City Beautiful movement. It represents an idea in relation to the library, knowledge, open space, a certain civility of public spaces. So when you cover that in AstroTurf and you have a white vinyl pavilion, these ideas are long gone. They are not perceptible. There's no relationship between this park and the library. And it's painful. And nobody is arguing for this. It's a public-private partnership, and it's a cash cow. My second example, and as egregious, is we all know what's happening in Washington Square Village, where the space between those 2 mid-century modern slabs, which is an open space, a green space, which provides a tremendous amount of visual relief to the dense neighborhood of Greenwich Village, and has been absorbed in the village pretty well. There's a plan to build towers in this open space, in the space itself, and then towers in the space related to the Silver Towers, which was recently designated. So it's open season on open spaces, and if we don't mobilize, if we don't pay attention to it, if we don't mount the historical and social and design argument for these spaces that we've been able to mount for buildings, we're going to have the buildings, but we're not going to have these open spaces. They will be recuperated. And so the relationship, you can't have towers in the park if you don't have the park. So these are architectural ideas. You can't have a library if you don't have the open space. So these are not just trees. It's not just about grass. So that's what we're trying to do. So this is a consciousness-raising operation. And it's also a call to arms, because I think that we just, we're just talking before the beginning of this, just now, about the fact that if it's designed by Olmsted, everybody mobilizes. But then if it's not, then all of a sudden it just becomes a lot less urgent. So I think we need to pay attention. There's a variety of open spaces in the city. There's a great plazas of the middle of the century. There's the City Beautiful movement spaces. There are urban parkways, Pelham Parkway. The Grand Concourse now looks like an expressway, which it doesn't need to be. It's a boulevard. That's not taken into account. So on and on and on. You can do a catalog in your mind and realize what's happening. So let's just mobilize about this. And before I introduce Charles, I just want to close with a quote from Samuel Ruggles, the man who founded Gramercy Park. And for those of you who read Diaries of New York City, he was the father-in-law of George Templeton Strong. And so in 1831, he declared, "Come what will, our open spaces will remain forever imperishable. Buildings, towers, palaces may molder and crumble beneath the touch of time, but space, glorious open space, will remain to bless the city forever." So let's make sure that he's right. So on this inspiring note, it is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Charles Birnbaum. Charles Birnbaum is the president of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, which he founded following a decade of work focused on landscape preservation and urban design. Recent projects include 2 web-based initiatives, What's Out There, a searchable database of the nation's design landscape heritage. I urge you to go to this database. I did it when I have to talk to Charles on the phone. It's really fun, and it's nationwide, and I think the more we put there, the better it will be. And another web-based initiative is Cultural Landscapes as Classrooms. He's a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, a partner in his conference. He is the author of many publications on the issue of cultural landscape preservation. He is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, a visiting professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and a frequent blogger for the Huffington Post. Please help me welcome Charles Birnbaum.
I often talk about open space being an incomplete sentence for most people. open space waiting for what comes next. And what I'd like to talk a little bit about tonight is hopefully what comes next. Hopefully through the lens of change and continuity, which is really embedded in this title in terms of looking at landscapes as dynamic cultural systems. The other thing I want to say, I don't know how people are attending the whole conference, but I'm delighted to be here as a prelude to folks like Ken Smith and others. I know you're going to be looking at the work of Clark and Rapawano, and what I really wanted to do this evening is weave through a broader legacy that goes beyond Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. In fact, I have to say, when I was looking at your 6 boards out there, I'm assuming it's Senior that is in the neighborhood because it just has the umbrella term of Frederick Law Olmsted in the Bronx, but I believe that was part of that very early plan. I'm a native New Yorker. If you are with me and I have a few glasses of wine, my accent will be much clearer to you all. And this is an image that I took when I often breakfast at Cook Shop, and it's my sort of haunt when I'm in town. And this is the sign that's right around the corner from there. And when I lived in New York City, beginning in the early 80s, these signs went up everywhere. Now think about this. This is pre-web. This was a way to basically begin to interpret what was underfoot and what was around us. And it was, of course, the districts, the buildings, often with really not an emphasis on landscape. But yet when you are in the city today, they are these sort of muted victims of the last 25 years. And I also think that they send a message about the state of the historic preservation movement. And it's not a good message. And I think that one of the challenges, and I should mention that there's sort of 2 parts to my talk tonight. The first part is sort of the burning things in my head right now that relate to this topic of open space. And then I'll conclude the talk with 5 sort of prescriptive areas that I think we can go deeper on, both with the leadership from the HDC and the New York chapter of the SLA and other partners. Now, the other thing I want to say is in the 80s, I was working on Prospect Park in Brooklyn. These are slides that I took in 1984. And if you go there today, it would be almost impossible to find these locations. The shelter has been rebuilt on the lake. The president's benches do not look like you have to do sort of gymnastical feats to sit down on them. Cleffridge Span is much happier looking today than it was then. But this was an era of capital projects then. So if it wasn't a boathouse or wasn't a structure, a bridge, the landscape was sort of left there in these interstitial spaces to fend for themselves. I'm also a product of the generation of Hair, the Milos Forman film, not the original Broadway production when Leslie Uggams took off her clothes. And so I was a big fan of Treat Williams, and this was the time in New York, Prince in the City, and Central Park was being reclaimed, and it was leading the way with Prospect Park running a very close second. And so we had this burgeoning awareness of Olmsted casting a very large shadow. And this is really what it looked like. And I like to show this image because the Damrosch Bandshell, of course, is a City Beautiful era addition, as Simone was suggesting. And it sort of sits there with outside of the narrative. And I'll come back to this a little later. It's hard to believe that this is what the sheep meadow looked like then. This was not after the Diana Ross concert, which is now famous. But it was pretty downtrodden. So now I'm going to make a leap. So I come back to New York all the time. I walk on the High Line. I have never experienced anything like this in terms of seeing this many happy people in one place at one time in New York City. So the question is, why am I showing you the High Line as I'm showing you Central Park? And what's been interesting to me about the High Line is you've seen them get awards from a variety of audiences, but rarely do you see the High Line presented as a historic preservation case study. And so for me, what is very interesting is when you think about the High Line and you think about Central Park, what they both have in common is great bone structure. And what I'd like to talk about tonight is this concept of understanding how to read great bone structure and what that means to all of us. You'll see that I'm going to try to avoid using the preservation word, and I think Simone was having a little fun with me when she was excited that the P word appeared in my bio, because it is a loaded term today. We have a brand problem right now, and I'm going to speak to that. Case in point. So here are the sort of burning issues that I'd like to address in my opening remarks. How do we address public perception in a challenging political landscape? And I'll say what I mean by that. The need for new, donor-driven, the silo mentality, pastiches, which I'll elaborate on at the close of the talk, and then what I call brand identity. What do we do with unpopular designs? The first is this idea of public perceptions in a challenging political landscape. This is actually was across the street from Cook Shop. For those of you, the garage doors are usually rolled up over here. This is 20th and 10th Avenue. And I would look out at this. Sometimes I see Ken Smith walking by when he's got his coffee in the morning. And then I noticed that there was this vandalism to this sign. And so to me, what was really interesting, thank you, was this attack on history. Now, the other place where preservation is being attacked quite a lot is in media right now. For those of you that saw the Architectural Record February issue, the entire issue was dedicated to historic preservation. Here was one of the lead essays. Critics and defenders of landmarking tend to agree on one key point, that the drive to landmark buildings of questionable significance is caused by a larger problem of communities feeling powerless to stop unwanted development. Now, when that came out, the same period in Washington, D.C., where I live, we saw the Washington City paper also delivering a similar message. You'll see here at the end, weapon wielded against development. I love that that's actually a term that you can link on, and there are multiple links to that. But here again, we're seeing in major cities that preservationists are under attack for using the standards and guidelines in a way that is to prevent change. That's a problem. Some of you may have seen Sarah Williams Goldhagen's piece last year in the New York Times opinion pages. Decisions are mostly left to the whims of overly empowered preservation boards, staffed by amateurs, casting their nets too widely and indiscriminately. And too many buildings are preserved not because of their historic value or aesthetic significance, but because of political or economic deal-making. Also in the record, Kathleen McGuigan, who's been on since the fall, who I think is incredibly sympathetic to a lot of these issues, states, Koolhaas has mounted an exhibition on the proliferation of preservation, most recently through an exhibition at the New Museum in New York last spring, arguing that the movement can be a crippling force in the development of cities. He has a point. Now, I think that Kathleen is a really balanced journalist, and if she's saying this, we're in trouble. So what are we doing about this? Here's the backdrop. 2010, Save America's Treasures cut. 2011, in New York State, where did the axe go? The New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, the DEC, was untouched. Historic Preservation had the greatest cut, over 8%. So what we're seeing is we're seeing a squeezing down at a federal and state level, and we're seeing the preservation community being labeled in a way that we have got an identity challenge that we have to address. So in this context, how do we move forward? How do we measure success? Now, I couldn't resist showing this, and I was delighted when Simone referenced what's happening at Washington Square Village, because what was so interesting to me, this happened in the same news cycle last week for me at home. First, I saw the silent protest. This was incredible. This was a turning point, making this a national news story. Now, I don't know if it's going to require a vaginal probe to some of these developers, but this is what we have going on in New York the very same week. And then this is what we put out there, a banner that says fight. Now, granted, we have got to rally the troops, but the problem right now is that we have an identity issue. And by doing this, we are feeding into that mentality of the angry mob. And the question is, how do we move beyond that? And this is part of the reason why we've got to change the way that we begin to do business. Now, this is Nikolai Orosov in the New York Times, and thankfully he is no longer with the New York Times. He's gone on to writing books, probably about buildings as objects. And here he was, celebrating the Gardner Museum. And you see the way he talks about the preservationists. He's not talking about the fact that he has destroyed the only intact villa compound in the Back Bay, or the fact that the Emerald Necklace will now have its back to the Gardner. Mrs. Gardner purchased this property in 1893, the year that Olmsted completed his work, which began in 1879. And instead, we shower this new building in all of this praise. And so what happens is the preservationists have been maligned. They've been equated with the angry mob in Frankenstein, and we have a new building, and the question is, how do we measure success? How do we measure success beyond the building program, the new spaces? I mean, granted, there'll be wonderful things that happen here. The question is, how do we do this? And the irony, and this is my most recent blog in the Huffington Post, is that in the last decade, 4 Massachusetts cultural institutions have collectively raised $1 billion for 4 buildings. One of those is the Museum of Fine Arts, which has raised $500 million. These buildings are on the Emerald Necklace. This is the first urban greenway in the world. Should be a World Heritage Site, and it limps along. The Conservancy raises a couple of $1 million a year for the necklace. And so why is it that we have a different value system for open space or historic design landscapes than we do for cultural institutions? So again, how do we measure success? Can we pick up a building and move it into a historic house and create a phony setting for it? This is something that happened recently. This is the Hamilton Grange house that was put into St. Nicholas Park, which is Samuel Parsons' most important picturesque landscape. We heard about the plans underway for the 2 new massive buildings. And the point about this project, what's interesting to me, we talk about open space, but this is also a Sasaki Walker project. And so before Pete Walker went off to the West Coast, what's interesting about New York now is you could bracket Pete Walker's career in New York City between this project and the World Trade Center site. When this project goes away, what we have left is Alice in Wonderland in Central Park. And so what I find interesting is that, again, we're only talking about this as if it's parsley around the roast. It's the green stuff. We're not talking about this as a historic resource. And I know I shouldn't be saying this because the camera's running right now, but I was at the MAS event last night, and what I was intrigued with is to find out that MAS has been involved in this process, and yet MAS, the Municipal Art Society, has 4 threads that they look at place, and one is called preservation and sustainability. And I would argue that that seems to only be applied to the building envelope and not to the space within. And Lincoln Center, I don't even know where to begin, but I will. And I have to say, I'm a real fan of what they've done around the edges of Lincoln Center. But the Beaumont, for example, aside from destroying the Kiley landscape that was here, we also have now foreshortened the pool. This is the only Henry Moore that Henry Moore cited himself in the US. And so we've changed the relationship between the sculpture and the landscape setting. So in all of those, I would say, how do you measure success? Now, when Francois was talking earlier, she was also talking about the environmental movement. And so here we have, as a Washingtonian, Michelle Obama. If you can't see her in the back row, you can recognize her by her really muscular arms. But here she is, taking care of the White House plantings, putting our vegetable garden in. This is all spin. Now, think about our angry mob. Now, here the White House is gone, and they've planted this. Now, if you look at the plan that's on the bottom here, you'll notice the area where the garden is. It's right in the Olmsted Brothers landscape. But if you actually move back a little bit, you'll notice there that there's a tennis court. The tennis court was actually from the Nixon administration, and my understanding is the Obamas are not big tennis players, and so no one's really using the court today. So why not rip up the court, create a permeable surface, take advantage of the chain link fence that no one can see, and you can grow beans and more robust plant material, vegetables, and not have it in the front lawn, in the manicured landscape, but inside there, you could put a 24-hour camcorder, you could find out what's going into the kitchen, but it's out there because of its visibility. And so this, to me, is no different than the buildings that we've seen, and this is something I'm going to come back to later. This is what I call plop and drop. And we can plop wind turbines in view sheds. Again, we are now being forced to deal with the environmental movement. So if we're not interested in bees or bats or sonar, what about it being hallowed landscape because of its ethnographic values? Here was an example recently that was happening in Iowa where this property that was gifted to the state was actually going to be returned because they couldn't deal with the amount of water to water the lawn as opposed to looking at a zero-escape solution. Number 4, which I'll elaborate on at the end of this, is pastiches as a viable design solution. I think if there was to be a pastiche design award given, it would go to the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation for the work realized during George Vilonicus' tenure. First time I've said that on camera, actually. and here's a sterling example of that. Now, would you call this historic preservation? What would you call this? Now finally, and I think this is the most difficult one, what do we do with unpopular designs? And Laurie Olin once used the term centers of energy, and he says that sometimes landscapes are just going to change every 25 years. They're centers of energy, and we just keep redesigning them. But what I found myself sort of thinking about for this evening is, I remember when the Sarah Torque ellipse, the tilted arc, happened here in the city. The preservation community was not involved in any way, shape, or form. I mean, here's one of the greatest artists of the last half century, and we were absent from that debate. The art community was engaged, but we were not part of it. Now think about Martha Schwartz's work. Again, something that came in, there was a discourse about it, and you can see on the image on the bottom right, it's been removed, and there's a new proposal that's gone forward. And I think what's interesting to me is what these projects have in common is there's a disconnect between the design and the historic preservation communities, that we're not coming together to look at multiple values to guide change. And instead what happens in many of these projects is we see wholesale eradication and redesign. One of the designers I'm going to come back to in a little bit is M. Paul Friedberg. And when you look at the modern post-war movement, Paul Friedberg is to New York what Larry Halpern was to the Bay Area. Along with Dan Kiley, these were the three probably most prolific designers of urban public space in the US. And what's happening as we speak is that we are literally eradicating Paul Friedberg's legacy from the American landscape. Right now in Minneapolis, there is PV Plaza, his design from 1973. These are the new design proposals. It is a wholesale removal of what is there. There's been tremendous discourse about it. There have been lots of editorials written. Nevertheless, I think when the funding is in place, PV Plaza will most likely, as it currently stands, not stand the test of time. This is the most influential landscape architect from the East Coast during this time. This is his most important extant work, and it may not endure. So the question is, how do we move away from these stereotypes? The preservers, you know them, they're the ladies that wear the white gloves. The ecologists, they travel with their box turtles. And the designers, they wear black. This is Martha Schwartz saying she's a bad girl. She's sitting in a very unladylike fashion with a phallus behind her. She's saying, I'm a designer, hear me roar. This is why I created the Cultural Landscape Foundation, to begin to move away from this silo mentality. And although we define cultural landscapes as being 4 types, I'm sure most people here are familiar with all of these, the reality is we have focused more on historic design landscapes because there are many other groups out there like the American Farmland Trust, the Nature Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, that deal with large-scale land conservation issues. And although we partner with many of those groups, we usually, as a sort of day-to-day business practice, do not lead in those situations. Our mission, quite simply, is to teach people how to see and how to value landscape architecture and the shapers of the American landscape in a way that we are hardwired to look at buildings. So if I were to say to you, for example, if you think about what makes a modern building, you would immediately have an image that you conjure up. But if I were to ask you what makes a modern landscape, would you immediately have an image of something that is a post-war design? We have 4 primary areas, and as Francois mentioned, there's the What's Out There database. We have our Pioneers series, where we have hundreds of biographical profiles on our website. It's over 600 at this point. Landslide, which is our annual watch list, and our cultural landscapes as classrooms. And I'll come back to what's out there in a little bit. So, okay, first the ground rules. Thank you guys for spelling Olmsted right on your 6 list. But there is more than one Olmsted. We all know he looked tired, but he didn't live from 1822 to 1957. Charlie Beveridge always beats me up when I show this picture. Now, the other thing is there are many people who are in the Olmsted office, and if you go to our Pioneers on our website, we have several dozen of those right now, many of which were with the firm for over 40 years. The person, for example, around here, Percival Gallagher, was with the firm for 41 years. But tonight what I'd like to do is lift the veil beyond Olmsted to people like Clark and Rapuano, who are in the middle on the top row next to Samuel Parsons, folks like Ellen Shipman and Beatrix Farrand, Paul Friedberg, Hideo Sasaki, Schemmerhorn, Thomas Dees, and others. And the backdrop for all of this, and sort of the birth of TCLF, was seeing the destruction of so many of these seminal landscapes and seminal works for these practitioners. Christopher Columbus Waterfront Park opened for the bicentennial. It was the first public modernist waterfront park, probably a seminal project for the Sasaki's office, largely altered. The Buford waterfront by Robert Marvin has now been sort of prettified, and you could even see these wonderful benches that Marvin had designed, so little outdoor porch swings on the waterfront, coexisting with something that's incredibly modern. Reese Hospital was destroyed in the hopes of securing the Olympics in Chicago. This was, of course, Gropius with Hideo Sasaki and Strong. And then here in New York, there is a long, unfortunate laundry list of really important works by Paul Friedberg that have not stood the test of time. This was the Delacorte fountain that he designed at the tip of City Hall. Some of you people may remember this. It was an homage to when the Croton Aqueduct came here. This is the Clark and Rapuano plan on the left-hand side. I'll come back to this in a bit. Reese Houses was destroyed in 2000. Pete Walker, when he wrote an introduction in the monograph on Spacemaker Press, said, "Modern urban landscape design began with the construction of Reese Park Plaza. Like Mises' Barcelona Pavilion, it was unlike anything seen before in the modern city." What is interesting to me is when this went away, there was no discourse. The preservation community, the design community, it just went away. And so I think on a positive note, that I think that wouldn't happen today. I think that there's a greater recognition for modernism, and there would have been a discourse about this. But I think, as sad as it is, I think that there has been an evolution in the last decade. Here are just some examples from this project. I don't know how much of Carver Houses remains, if this also has been considerably revised, but this is sort of the tail end of Friedberg's modern legacy pre-Battery Park City in New York. And as I mentioned before, PV Plaza. So let's talk about value and how we begin to assess value for the rest of this presentation. So how do we move forward? What I would like to do is talk a little bit about survey and registration, how we might embrace a broader palimpsest for landscape, bridging the nature-culture divide, pursuing authenticity, and getting design back into historic preservation. First is survey and registration. What's interesting to me is that if you look at the website for Van Cortlandt Park, which is one of the largest parks in New York City, there's nothing about it being a historic resource. But if you go to the municipal archives and take a peek, there were letters from the 1880s that illustrate how it was Calvert Vaux that laid out many of the roads in the park, and yet there's no recognition for that. So there's about 82,000 National Register properties. About 1,900 have significance in landscape architecture. Of the NHLs, there's about 60 plus that have significance in landscape architecture. And of the 8 initial designations, 4 are the work of Olmsted, no surprise. My favorite thing here is when Fairstead, the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site, became a National Historic Landmark, Olmsted was spelled with an A. So he's got about 1/10 of the designations. Now, what's also interesting to me is that, again, when you lift the veil on the Olmsted firm, Leon Zach, for example, who's one of our profiles on our website, was very much engaged in Fort Tryon, and yet there's very little, probably most people here have never heard of Leon Zach. So the question is, how do we begin to make these folks visible, and how do we move beyond what I call the big house? For example, if you take a look at the New York Botanical Gardens, only Robert Gibson's Italian Renaissance Museum is mentioned by name in terms of designers in the 1983 designation. There's 102 McKim and White buildings listed in New York State. Some of them are associated with campuses. None of them have significance in landscape architecture. Grant's Tomb is where it is because of Samuel Parsons and Calvert Vaux. Samuel Parsons took the widow Grant on a carriage ride when she wanted to put it on the mall in Central Park and convinced her this promontory was a superior location. The Grecian-style shelter was designed by Parsons for the New York City Department of Parks. None of these elements are contributing features. The landscape has no significance. The historic district that was done for the Brooklyn Heights district that was done in 65, 66 goes to the East River, and yet the first cantilevered promenade in the US, a significant work of both landscape architecture and engineering, is not designated. Olmsted and Vaux's only other Manhattan commission, Mount Morris Park, now known as Marcus Garvey Park, later redesigned by Clark and Rapuano, so we have an interesting palimpsest going on here. The only thing designated here is the fire tower, which was designated in '76. So you start to see a pattern here. Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn, Olmsted and Vox yet again, and again, no designation. I mentioned St. Nicholas Park earlier. Really, this is the only landscape by Parsons in the picturesque style that's largely intact in his hand today, should be designated. What was remarkable to me, and this came to my attention from Columbia students this past semester, is Forest Park in Queens, New York. I didn't even realize that Olmsted Elliott practiced in New York, and this is an overlay project with Charles Downing Lay, over 500 acres. It has areas of limited integrity and areas of very high integrity, as you can see by the wonderful landform here on the bottom left. Again, you get out of Manhattan, and with the exception of Prospect Park, when it comes to landscapes, there's very little designations out there. So I guess my question for HDC, as they look at the neighborhoods, is there a way to cast a larger boundary so that you begin to capture some of these relationships as a way to elevate the stature of the invisible hand of the landscape architects? Sunset Park in Brooklyn is another palimpsest of Parsons and Clark and Rappuano. I know that Tom Campanella is going to be speaking tomorrow, which I'm really looking forward to, and probably no landscape architecture firm is more invisible and have done more for the city than Clark and Rappuano. Just a couple of examples: Stuyvesant Town and Cadman Park Plaza. Both are, very much intact in some ways in terms of the big ideas. In terms of Clark and Rappuano, again, no designations here in the city whatsoever. Harold Caparn, who had many projects at the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, among other cultural institutions, nothing designated. I also think it's interesting that the place where the National Design Awards is given at the Cooper Hewitt, where a medal is given for landscape design, there's no recognition for their William Schemmerhorn landscape, which is an incredibly popular space and a rare New York commission for Schemmerhorn. And then I think moving up to sort of the more recent period, I think what's interesting today as we've come back and really urban agriculture has taken hold, we realize how prescient Liz Christie's ideals and principles were as both a gardener and an activist. And I would argue that the Lower East Side Community Garden is hallowed ground today. Fantastic. That's fantastic. Look at how fast we work here. The work of Bob Zion, I don't really worry about the future of Paley Park. I don't think there's ever been a better landscape steward than the foundation here. But again, wouldn't it be great to honor it as the first Vest Pocket Park with a National Historic Landmark designation? IBM Plaza has diminished integrity. I'm not really sure what you call MoMA at this point as a complete reconstruction, but nevertheless it is still very much as it was. And again, here's Bob Zion, whose entire career was in the region. His hand is invisible in terms of recognition, in terms of designations. And then finally, I'll show just 3 little examples where both the landscapes and architecture are not designated. The first 2 I'm going to show because, to my knowledge, they're the only 2 bits of extant Kiley design in New York City at this point. The first is the Ford Foundation atrium. The second, with a higher degree of integrity, is his work at Rockefeller University. And the question I would ask everyone here that cares about landscape architecture and historic preservation and history is, should New York be able to say, we have representative examples of the most important post-war landscape architects in the world? Because pretty soon, we're not going to be able to do that. And these are just slipping away, and these are the last bits and pieces. And then, the World's Fairgrounds, as well as sort of a major example of Clark and Rappuano's work, also nothing is designated here. So with that, I think one of the things that would be wonderful, and I think it seems an incredible opportunity to be here this evening with this collaboration between the HDC and the New York ASLA, is looking at the old way of getting survey dollars. The way that New York Preservation Movement was born, to begin to partner with universities like Columbia with students to begin to do a context statement for post-war design or the work of Clark and Rappuano. But this is a very fertile field, and I think that clearly this city seems very interested. If you go to the New York City Parks websites for most of these parks today, they have really built out the histories. There's a lot, so there's a recognition there, but we haven't translated that into designations. And so the question is why? And can a coalition of groups come together to make that happen? Case in point, here are the door stoppers that Bob Stern and et al. Have produced over the years. I do think it's interesting that New York 1960, that the parsley around the roast here is Central Park. You know, here it is right on the cover. And then this little publication, I don't know if people have seen this. This was put out by the New York chapter of the ASLA. Mine, the pages have all fallen out and it's held together with rubber bands. But I showed this because that's it. There really is not a survey of the hand of the landscape architect in New York, something that begins to do for landscape what Stern has done for architecture. And now here are just 4 examples of other states. In the state of Maine, they've done all of these landscape surveys. We've actually been working for the last 2 years with a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to take all these surveys that were done that were sitting in files, and we now will have at the end of this spring 150 of Maine's most important landscapes all built into our What's Out There database, so people can then find out what's there. The state of Rhode Island, and this is free if you've never seen this, from the Rhode Island Historical Commission, have created a context statement for all of their landscape architecture. At the University of Florida, architecture students have done survey work and published a book. This is with Rocco Seo and Joanna Lombard on the historic landscapes of Florida. And then lastly, the ASLA chapter partnered with the State Historic Preservation Office on publishing a monograph on the landscape architecture of the state of Minnesota. One of my happiest moments is when I was able to see this for purchase in the airport bookstore in the Twin Cities. I thought, okay, we're really hitting the big time now. But this issue of context, how do these landscapes stack up, is really often one of the challenges. The thing, when you yelled out about Liz Christie, what's nice is that she was the leader. It's indisputable. But for a lot of these other landscapes, if you say Schemmerhorn, for example, well, how important was he and what survives? And that's always the challenge, and which is why we created the What's Out There database. And just to give you a little preview about the What's Out There project, every week we put up about 5 sites, and as I look out in the room here and I see some of my former Columbia students, I know that their work is also represented in the database. So for example, you can search by a landscape type. There's a drop-down menu. There's 27 types, like plazas, and 54 subtypes. Parks has about 15 subtypes. You can go in and get a definition of plazas, for example. You can see featured examples. You see the designers who have plazas in there. In this case, there's maybe 6 pages or 7 pages of plazas. Let's say we want to go into the Art Institute landscape. You'll see that it brings up a map which shows you all the sites in the region. You can download images. You're free to take these. If you want something higher resolution, you have to contact us. Here is the Art Institute. You might then say, oh, well, this was designed by Dan Kiley. Tell me more about the landscape. Tell me more about Kiley. It'll then give you a full list of all of Kiley's landscapes and all related material. It is really a context-making machine, but it's also great when you find that you have canceled flights and you pull out your iPhone and you say, okay, I've got 4 hours to kill. What can I go see here in Atlanta? This will tell you. So if you don't get our monthlies, do sign up for them. And then there's also 14 styles, such as modernist. Next, what I'd like to do is talk about this idea of palimpsest and what this means in the landscape. And what's interesting to me is that, you know, as the landscape architecture community came onto the scene of doing historical cultural landscape reports, the architecture community, of course, has been doing historic building surveys since the 1930s. And what's interesting is that historically, landscape architects were doing this. We just kind of dropped the ball along the way. These were measure drawings, for example, that Shercliffe did of Virginia Gardens to inspire his work at Williamsburg. Here, for example, is something that was very short-lived. It was an outgrowth of Habs called the Historic American Gardens Survey, done in New England in the 30s. I think it failed because it was called HAGS. And here are the 4 period plans that they did. And what's amazing in these plans is they actually even show you when they're conjecting. These plans have footnotes. This really has a high level of scholarship engaged in this process. And then the last example I'll show you, this was done for the ladies at Mount Vernon. And Charles Sprague Sargent did a very detailed vegetation analysis in the 20s that would rival any plan that I've seen done recently for vegetation management and renewal. So this was all part of practice. So to illustrate the challenge of palimpsest and this issue of giving open space and the hand of the landscape architect and identity, I'll just give you 2 examples. The first is Central Park. Its period of significance when it was designated is 1850 to 1866. If you go to the What's Out There database, you'll see a list of many designers. We only have so many that come down on the home page. But just to give you an example, this year the Central Park Conservancy will finish their restoration work of Mrs. Russell Sage's rhododendron mile around the reservoir. This was laid out by Samuel Parsons. Think about all of the City Beautiful era additions that were made to this landscape that are outside of the period of significance. Thomas Price and Betty Sprout, who collaborated on the conservatory garden, this very Burle Marx plan that he did for the Brazilian Pavilion during the same time. Again, this is a rare project by Price in New York City. This is actually the model that was driven to New York by Stu Dawson of Sasaki Dawson DeMay in his first weeks of employment with Sasaki Walker. And he had never been to Manhattan before and had to drive the model to Central Park for presentation. The Richard Datner Adventure Playground, which I believe has a local designation. And of course, Paul Friedberg's playgrounds. So the question is, with standards for changing play, the fact that all of these things are outside of the period of significance, what does that mean to their identity? Are they safe and secure? How do we guide change? These places shouldn't be mothballed, but the question I would say is, because they're outside of the period of significance, how do we illustrate their value? And I would even argue, just to be a little bit provocative, I would argue that the work of the Central Park restoration is now eligible for consideration because Bruce Kelly and Phil Winslow are no longer with us. You can bracket their careers. They were two formidable players in this process, and we should understand their contributions to the plan as a way to begin to think about a broadening period of significance that leads right up to the rebirth and the renaissance of Central Park. Now, the one that surprised me, I have to say, in preparing for tonight was the New York Botanical Gardens. I've always known that it's on the register. I knew it was a landmark district, so I just assumed it had significance in landscape architecture. NYBG's only areas of significance are education and science. Now, when we step back for a moment, again, a long list of designers, unrivaled in New York City, unquestionably. You have the original plan by Vaux and Parsons, 1895. This is the year that Calvert Vaux walks off of a pier and drowns in the Hudson. I don't know if this plan is what did it to him, but nevertheless, it's a very, it's a capstone project to say the least. We then have his plan providing the framework for John Brindley. And Brindley's there for quite some time and has many significant projects of his own in terms of circulation systems, the Rock Garden and Rose Garden Stairway. The Olmsted brothers come along and are very much involved with rethinking circulation networks. You have the first of a series of country place women landscape architects, the Rose Garden by Beatrix Ferrand from the 1910s. The Olmsteds continue their involvement here. I mean, what I find remarkable about this analytical plan is this looks like something that could have been drawn recently. There's a level of depth to the analysis that's happening here to understand how to get the circulation systems to function better. You have Ellen Shipman coming on the scene with the Ladies' Border. And then you have the period of Clark and Rappahannock, which, as with Central Park, is also significant at NYBG. And then you have Marion Coffin. Now I'm going to pause here for a moment because I don't know of another American landscape where the three seminal women figures of the country place movement, Coffin, Ferrand, and Shipman, are all represented on one site. And you know, I think ironically about that there was an Emily Dickinson exhibition at NYBG last year which had all of these interpretive threads. And you know, you've got women's studies and feminism embedded in all of this. And here are these three women all there and not a connection made in that narrative. Dan Kiley comes along for a series of projects with Barnes and others. And then finally, Webble. This is an unrivaled palimpsest. And I can only tell you all of this because NYBG have been such good stewards that they've done one heck of a cultural landscape report that has all of this information. And so the question is, why not now take that and pursue National Historic Landmark as a preeminent work of landscape architecture representing all of these impertures? So bringing this home now, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the nature-culture divide. And for those of you that are not landscape architects, you might not know that there's about, I get all these different numbers, 33,000, 35,000 landscape architects. About half of those are members of the professional society. And then within that, there are professional groups. There's one for historic preservation that they represent about 2% of the profession. And we say, okay, you guys, you're the preservers. You know, you go talk to yourselves. The designers, you guys in black, you come over here to this side of this room. And so there's this mentality that somehow you preserve or you design as embodied in these special interest groups. This is my one bit of cheap animation. There's no sound. But it represents the kind of segmented divide. I call this the bees and bunnies, the bricks and bollards, the brownfields and the battlefields. And these are the sort of stereotypes that we all play out in our practice, in our community meetings. I mean, think about how many times you've gone to a community meeting and someone stands up and you know what they're going to say before they talk. You've seen that person before, they've got their issue, they're one of my bees. But how do we begin to move beyond that? So my proposal is that we think about historic places, we think about design as 4 C's: collections, living and non-living; community, basically everyone that lives and works and plays in these places; containers, I like to talk about landscapes, as buildings, as objects in the landscape; and then finally, context being both the physical setting and context being my Russian nesting dolls, how these landscapes stack up. So to give you an example of how we then put this in action, how many people here are on the boards of non-for-profits? Can I just ask for a show of hands? Now, I'm going to ask for a different show of hands. How many people are on the boards of non-for-profits that have revisited their mission in the last 3 to 5 years? Okay, so about a little bit more than a third to a half. One of the things that's interesting to me is when we think about this segmented divide, what happens when we deal with mission statements? I was really excited when I was preparing for this talk to see that Morningside Park has revisited their mission. And it's, you know, there's a lot of homestead in here. And I think it's sort of interesting that at the end they get the kind of catch-all about promote various facilities and functions within Morningside Park. But there, you could see here, there's a strict emphasis on understanding their legacy. Now I'm going to compare this with the Van Cortlandt Park Conservancy. And it's interesting because I always think about conservancies because of places like Central Park as really having historic value. And their mission is to sustain and enhance the park as a vibrant destination for recreation, leisure, and enjoyment of natural landscapes. So there's no recognition at Van Cortlandt Park that they are in fact a historic resource. So how do you begin to move forward in terms of putting the kind of values that we want when you have a mission statement like that? And finally, one of the things that I thought was kind of the elephant in the room, knowing that we're going to be hearing a lot about Clark and Rapawano tomorrow, but also knowing that New York Restoration Project and MAS and so many groups now are looking at the city's legacy of public housing and the New York City Housing Authority. How do you begin to instill value when you have an institution whose mission is to provide decent and affordable housing? I mean, it's not to say there's a problem with that. The question becomes, how do you begin to bring this kind of vision and values for historic fabric, if that remains within that existing mission? So with that as kind of a setup to the closing, what I'd like to end with is looking at authenticity and the design historic preservation interface. This is one of my favorite images to show. It's a cheap joke. I've shown it before. It's one of the 22 squares in Savannah. It's one of 2 that have lost their integrity. What I love about this is it was given over to a playground, and then the historians, I guess, were really upset that it lost its historic character, so they plopped a gazebo and a cannon in there. And I love that the cannon is pointed at the swing set. It's just awesome. They're going to put these outside of Sarah Beth's kitchens around Manhattan, is my understanding. When I went to Rome also, the whole idea of authenticity was something that I was thinking about, and I brought with me Dickens. And I was reading about the Forum in my first weeks there, and he writes, "A ruin, 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 God be thanked, a ruin." And here is this ruin of the Church of St. Cosmos and Damian from the same period of Dickens' writings. And then I went there, and it looks like a suburban landscape. I mean, it has what Tommy Church called the parsley around the roast. We have our viburnums, and we have our obligatory strip of lawn. So why is it that when it comes to the building, that we can accept the patina, we can accept the ruin, but when it comes to the landscape, that it's pastiche season? So why is it that we stretch the truth when it comes to landscape? Why is our vision and value for beauty and not authenticity? Authenticity, of course, according to the New York Times, I thought ironically, when this was published on September 11th, 2011, is the value of the moment. Some of you may have seen Gwen Ifill last week taking the mantle of authentic means that people believe And Santorum rolled out his whole family in his debate with Romney. Michelle Bachmann, I'm authentic. This is a disturbing photograph of Anderson Cooper. I don't know what's going on here, but Pete is going to be all over this. In everything I've done, I've always tried to be authentic and real. I think I love to be my authentic self. I believe in being authentic as possible. Good for you, Hillary. So let's think about this quest for authenticity. This to me seemed like one of those targets that I had to throw a bullseye at tonight, which has been in the news quite a lot. The New York Times has given this a lot of ink. But what's fascinating to me in all of the reporting, it's cost and it's emotion. It's emotion, and emotion, of course, is feeling. And feeling, of course, when you think about the 7 aspects of integrity, what's been interesting to me is that whoever has weighed in publicly have not really said, well, now wait a minute, okay? New York City Parks understands the standards and guidelines. So where are the I'm not going to read all of these things on the screen here, but you can see here, when you look at design, materials, workmanship, feeling, all of these things are here. This is a slam dunk. If we can't win this one as an argument about why this is important, then we again have a communication messaging problem. Because cost is nominal. I mean, yes, it's real money, but in the age of public-private partnerships and the amount of press that this project has received, I'm sure there are private donors that would come forward for something like this. And so I've been kind of intrigued that this may not be there, that you won't have that sound, that feeling. You have to draw the line somewhere. And I would say that this is one of those places, when it's gone, it's gone. And if the character of this changes, it is forever changed. And so, what's with it? Like, why can't we get this? And I think that if we can't figure something like this out, then I believe in New York, the preservation movement is in deep trouble. This should be a slam dunk, happy days are here again, balloons falling from the sky. Wow, how could we have ever thought about putting down concrete? I can't say anything more about it, but I can say more about plop and drops. This is our open space that Francois was referencing. Here is a National Historic Landmark. It is on the Mississippi, and you come out of the back of this house, and you see this stuff. And you think, what am I looking at? Or like, can you imagine, like, number 4 looks like a really good time. I'm going to take the path to 1, then I'm going to go to 4, I'm going to check out 5. Now think about this as we try to make these sort of, we're teaching people how to see. Open one window to the Mississippi and show an oil refinery, and talk about the cancer rate in the state of Louisiana and women and breast cancer. And then open another window and show a pastoral scene. Then we're going to teach people how to live in the landscape, but instead we have this. We check the box. This is what I refer to poo-poo platters for the ADD generation. We have community-based projects where we ask people what they want, and then we splay the stuff out. This is a Lawrence Halpern landscape, believe it or not. It was his only project in Missouri. And I love to tell this story because it all started with a phone call from a retired shoe merchant. And it is not one of Halpern's most important projects. This was the derelict downtown department store that was going to be turned into condos right before the markets crashed. And you can see that this is more like an Indiana stratified limestone, so it's a very different typology for Halpern. And so this person called us up and she said, my daughter, who happened to study landscape architecture, told me that Halpern was an important guy, and I'm just a retired shoe merchant, but I remember when this park opened, and she Googled Halpern, and she found us, and we said, well, Ruth, tell us your story. We put it on our website, we illustrated it, and we began working through social media. This is what was going to go in. This is my poo-poo platter. Here's phase 1, here's phase 2. You see the poor fountain saying, what is going on around me? And we were fortunate that there were federal funds that were going to happen. And so we then partnered with the National Trust and other groups, and we actually convinced them to put the money into the perimeter streetscape so they didn't lose their funding. It's now having a rehab plan, and I'm happy to say that in 2010 it was the first Lawrence Halpern landscape listed on the National Register. It was in a pre-existing historic district that had been done years earlier with buildings that went through the 20s. It now includes the central space. And so this all happened because of a grassroots community effort and some really interesting bloggers by people like the name Jake Hammer. So when is it pastiche? When is it preservation? Hideo Sasaki once used the term the 5 Bs: bricks, banners, balloons, Bradfords, and benches. This bench, I think, that we see everywhere looks a lot like a Mickey Mouse foot. It's part of the Disneyfication of Main Street there and the US. Here it is, the 1939 World's Fair bench in its logical location on the East River as part of the Clark and Rappuano era. See the hex pavers. Here it is in Martin Scorsese's film The Age of Innocence in 19th century Boston. But this is what we do. We just pick up the stuff and we splay it about, and we have very different standards for authenticity. But think about Scorsese when he has a team of 100 people on a film looking at these issues from wallpaper to China and food. And I have to say he's gotten much better. I was really trying to get him in Slaves of New York. I haven't seen Hugo. But it's fun to do this in New York. But this is what's happened for the last 20 years in the city, is this kind of pastiching of these parks. And so, my question is, where is the preservation community on these? Where are the critics that are looking at this work from the lens of historic preservation and design? Madison Square Park, for example, here's the plan. Here are my plop and drops. And what's interesting to me is you think about these paintings by Charles Hassam, you think about these photographs by Stieglitz, and when you now go from Madison to Fifth, you literally have a very tall playground right in that seminal viewshed. And it's not to say that a playground shouldn't go in that park, it should, but the question is, was that the best location? Should it have gone along a perimeter where it already has a fence around it on one side? The Shake Shack, as much as we like their burgers and shakes, what does that mean? Why is that successful? And it is replicating itself all over the country. And then, of course, we embellish it with lush plantings, and we call this successful. When is it pastiche? When is it preservation? Look at this. Did you know that I moved from Madison Green to City Hall Park? And I don't know if people know this. This is the craziest story I will tell you tonight. This was a fountain designed by Jacob Ray Mould of Bethesda Terrace fame. Joy Kestenbaum, the historian, found it as a planter in a Bronx park. And it was brought back for this plan. It was, quote, restored. These light fixtures were never there historically. They basically brought it back to do a vaginal probe to it. And I knew I was going to get back there at some point this evening, and this is what they did. Here is the earlier park. And if you look, for example, here, look at the fence posts at the base. Those are there now. They were only there in the 1810s to the 1830s. Here, the central passageway was the Clark and Rappuano. Again, the new plantings, of course, that had a different fountain at the base. This is what it looked like then. I'm going to go back for a minute. So we have the mold fountain there now. Here is the mold from the Clark and Rappuano. It's just sort of this color forms. Mix and match it. Give it some parsley. Great. And we did the same. We even got more ambitious down at Washington Square. You'll notice here that the fountain is not on axis, of course. The fountain is now on axis. It has been turned into a City Beautiful era feature. This to me was one of the most mind-boggling things, but at least there was a great discourse about this. I think this was, I hate to use the phrase teaching moment, but I think it really was. There was a very spirited discourse about this. And granted, it's great to see the fountain animated, but the question is, did it have to be moved to be animated? Here, of course, you can see the plan. And it's worth noting that this is also something that Calvert Vaux and Samuel Parsons were involved in. And again, if you go to the Municipal Archives, you'll see the drawings back and forth between the McKim Mead and White office and Vaux and Parsons. Now, I know this is a bit of an abrupt leap from that fountain to this fountain, but I wanted to show this in terms of the visitor center, because our theme today is open space. And one of the things when it comes to landscapes, and we think about the Secretary standards, that the seminal thing to consider are visual and spatial relationships. So when we insert a building in St. Nicholas Park, when we insert a 2.5-story play structure into the middle of Madison Green, when we put a new visitor center in that's about viewing from the visitor center and changing the relationship to these footprints, then we are significantly altering the integrity of a site. To me it was interesting, this is the only time I've ever seen this much focus on a Bradford pear, ever. I cannot imagine what it's going to take to keep this puppy going. But I will tell you that it's gripping. It is how many people have been here, have seen this? I mean, the Bradford Pear is an unbelievable thing, and people are being photographed in front of it. I mean, it's an incredible thing to think. I'm sorry, this is on the World Trade Center site. This is the witness tree, if you will. Think about a battlefield landscape. This is the tree that barely survived. And I believe it was taken off site during this. It was nurtured back to health. I know that they've taken genetic cuttings. I mean, it's an incredible story. But I show this because it is authentic. We're talking about authenticity here. And so to me, I think what's interesting is to think about this in relation to the survivor staircase, which was a lifeway in many ways. And of course, this will now be in the visitor center. It will no longer have its integrity of setting. But I want to end the integrity and authenticity piece by showing you a survey done by the Smithsonian Institution with all 14 museums over several years. When they surveyed Americans when they were going to a Smithsonian property, and they said, what are you looking for? Number one, see the real thing. Think about our boardwalk issue. See the real thing. Gaining information and insight. Spending time with friends and family. Feeling awe and wonder. Feeling pride in America. This is what we do. So why do we have a hard time selling the concept of authenticity when the public is demanding it? And this is the challenge, I think, that we have in terms of how we get our message out. So in closing, I think one of the solutions here, again, is this bridge building between design and historic preservation communities. This is the Diana Memorial, by the way, in St. James's Park, an insertion. Society Hills in Philadelphia, I was just there again last week, and it's a wondrous place. And I think it is a glorious celebration, of the interface between design and historic preservation. Richard Longstreth and others have more recently waxed prose very poetically about how there is a dignity to the restraint of the insertions that happen by Pei and Gergela and the landscape architect Collins and others. And you go there today, and not only do you have a very significant, one of the most significant federal-style building collections in the US, but you now also have side by side a great story of the birth of the preservation movement post-66, and buildings that have dignity individually and collectively. Historic materials are being used in a unique and thoroughly modern way in every nook and cranny in this community. And I think this is the sort of difference of what's happened as we have begun to professionalize historic preservation. And I think that we have got to build these bridges so that students are not only coming out of school writing a critical thesis on an individual pane of glass at Glass House, but understanding the larger landscape of what Frank Lloyd Wright was interested in when citing that building and the nature-culture divide that happens there. Here's another example. This is the oldest mapped parkland in Allegheny County. It was designed by the fourth place losers in the Central Park competition, Mitchell and Grant. And they had a lake. It was called Lake Elizabeth. It was drained during the Second World War. And then ultimately it was redesigned in the 60s because they couldn't put a deep lake in there because they would find cars and other things in it. And this was the north side. It was pretty rough and tumble. And then a movement happened as part of the Olmstedian celebration of American parks. You see it was drained here, and there was a movement to bring back the old Lake Elizabeth. And I went out there, and I looked at this, and I've never seen this in any of my textbooks. And I thought, gosh, whoever designed this really knew what they were doing. It's beautifully detailed. And so I called John Simons, who was then living, and he said, yeah, I did it. And then that evening, I'm in my hotel room sleeping. It's about 4:15 in the morning, and my hotel light starts flashing on the telephone. And I called the front desk, and I said, my light is flashing. Can you make it stop? And they said, well, an elderly gentleman just dropped a package off for you. I said, okay, it's 4:50. I said, I'll come down and get it in the morning. And on the envelope, John Simons had written the entire history of parks and open spaces in Pittsburgh and had given me a copy of his plan that he did with his brother, Phil Simons. They were called Cut and Fill around the office. And lo and behold, was this amazing plan. And the other cool thing about this is you can see that this plan really reached into a much larger part of the landscape. The aviary was going to be expanding. And people saw this plan. They made the connection to Mellon Square, my nesting dolls again. They had the context to say, wow, this is Simons, this is important. A cultural landscape report was done. Lake Elizabeth has been restored, and the park is moving forward. Here's another example. Although I can't tell you a happy ending to this, I don't know where it is right now. This is Belle Isle Park in Detroit. This is over 40 years of Olmsted Firm's involvement. I love showing this building. It's the refectory building from the Olmsted era, and then you have this trapezoidal-shaped thing that then has these steps that lead down to a water feature. And lo and behold, it's from Kylie's master plan. And so you have this Kylie overlay. I love the color of the pergola responding to the clay tile roofs. And then the steps are very reminiscent of Caldwell's work in Chicago, and there's a Caldwell facility on the other side of the water body. So what Kylie was doing here is he's connecting the picturesque and the modern. And we see this playing out today. As a Washingtonian, I see this on Pennsylvania Avenue with the insertions here, which have brought back the elms and their geometry, in addition to, to this new paving pattern, which does not flow in front of the White House. This is contextual in the same way that Society Hill is. Martha Schwartz's Lifesavers, as the locals call it at HUD, this was a very forlorn plaza. It had the carrying capacity for this kind of insertion. And then I think probably the most interesting recent case study is Lincoln Road. It was opened, it was closed, it was open again. This was another Martha design. The street was then closed more recently. And I think what has been done here by Raymond Jungles is just remarkable. And for those of you that read Vanity Fair, open the current issue this month. There is a wonderful photographic essay about the Herzog and de Muren building, where Jungles did all of that landscape. The developer was the client for the street. And what's remarkable is Jungles is never mentioned. And the last paragraph of the Vanity Fair piece says that Herzog and de Muren designed everything right down to the toilet paper holders. And this is the challenge. We have to make these landscapes visible. And then here's Ken Smith and his work at Lever House. And so we're talking about managing change. We're not using the P word, but we're talking about guiding these landscapes into the future in a way that we honor their design intent and their narrative. So in closing, I can't help but end by coming back to the High Line, because this is our moment too in the preservation world, that we have to seize this. We have to take this as our own. We have to celebrate this, and we have to learn from this. Not just that it's enormously successful and people are having an awesome time, but this insertion, this narrative. What do we do in this quest of looking at these other projects where it is all or nothing? How do we begin to maintain the integrity of place? I encourage you to sign up for our e-letters. I do have some propaganda on the table outside, and I've been told I can answer a few questions if there are some. I thank you all for coming out tonight.